Hello and welcome, Goblin here, and tonight we're going to read some very strange stories. These come from the website Your Ghost Stories, my favorite place to seek out first-hand paranormal experiences. However, I wouldn't classify the accounts we are reading tonight as ghost stories, but they are definitely intriguing and bizarre. The theme that brings all these tales together is the color green, because all the entities in the stories are green. But as to what they are exactly remains to be determined. A variety of different supernatural beings have been associated with the color green. Aliens, of course, often referred to as little green men, fairies, goblins, even ghosts. Green is a color full of paradoxes and contradictions. It's the color of health, but if someone is looking green, it means they're sick. In the US, money is green, so it can symbolize abundance, but also greed and jealousy. Green is also the hue of living things, of lush forests and thriving plant life, but it's also the color of poison and putrefaction, and is even sometimes associated with death. And while green is indeed the color of natural things, these verdant creatures that appear in our stories tonight are definitely, well, supernatural. In addition to reading these first-hand accounts of the paranormal, we'll also take a look at some interesting comments that reveal even more strange encounters and discuss a few green folk of legend. If all that sounds good to you, let's get started. The first story was submitted from the United Kingdom by Chiri Moya. It's called The Green Man with Red Eyes. I grew up in suburbia in the north of England in a place called Birkinshaw, just outside the old mill city of Bradford. Me, Mum, Dad, and my brother lived in a house that was only 30 years old, built on an old farmland. I had my own room, and so did my brother, who also had supernatural experiences. Most people, as babies, remember nothing. However, I remember being scared of a green man standing in the corner of my room who had red eyes and horns. It terrified me as a baby and young toddler. Mum never believed me or my brother, who spoke of a dark, shadowy figure towering over his bed as well as a boy trying to play with him. Once at school, I would have been maybe 6. A friend took me around the back of the school where we were not meant to be and said, "Look, can you see that?" It was the green man in the distance, digging with a pickaxe. This happened twice. Research shows evil can shapeshift. Isn't that story fascinating and quite creepy? There was something particularly strange and interesting to me about the end bit, about the author's friend leading them around the back of the school to show them the green man digging with a pickaxe. I wish there were some more details to this story because it's just so unusual and intriguing. The author mentions that they would love to look up this old school friend of theirs and see if she remembers this too. I can understand why they would want validation for such an odd experience. As for the entity in the story goes, I was basically picturing like a classic devil figure with short pointed horns and bright green skin instead of red. It also reminded me of the Green Man from folklore, or more appropriately, from neo-paganism and architecture. Nowadays, it's widely recognized as a symbol of nature and a god of the woods in modern paganism akin to Pan. The Green Man is a man whose face is comprised of leaves, fanning away from his face by way of his cheeks and forehead, replacing the hair on his beard, even growing out from his mouth, his eyes gazing intently out from the foliage. Usually, it's just his face you see. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen one of these faces nailed to a tree or hung up in someone's garden. Actually, they are very prominent in architecture, and particularly appear in many churches across the UK, carved from stone and peering down from corners, much like gargoyles. The origins of the Green Man are somewhat muddled. Some claim that he is an ancient Celtic forest deity and personification of nature, but many think that there isn't enough evidence to support that, and think that he only became a part of folklore from around the 1940s. It's hard to say. Even if he was a part of pagan Celtic mythology, they were a culture that didn't keep any written records, so it's nothing we can say for sure. So it's possible, but it's also possible that he's a being borrowed or adapted from another pre-Christian religion, such as Bacchus. As I mentioned before, the Green Man appears in a lot of churches as a stone carving, primarily in England, but there are instances of them all over the world. Before the Green Man name was coined in 1939 by an amateur folklorist, much like myself, named Lady Raglan, they were called foliate heads. They are so common that in some churches they outnumber depictions of Jesus. The reason for their ecclesiastical presence is as unclear as their origins. Some people have related it to some biblical sermons regarding the tree used for crucifixion. Those who attribute the foliate heads to pagan worship believe that they were either placed purposefully on churches to claim dominance of Christianity over the old gods, or, inversely, think that they were carved in sneakily by the native Celtic tradesmen who did the stonework on these churches. Whatever the case, the image of the Green Man is undeniably striking. But as far as the Green Man in the story we read, it seems that the author is not the only person to have witnessed this being. A comment from Rex says, "I appreciate this story being put up for the world to see, and I for one disagree with those who call him, the Green Man, imaginary, for I have seen him on several occasions. I have lived in the same house since I was born. I first saw it at the age of 5 around midnight when I was awoken by a loud noise on my closet door. I abruptly rose out of bed to look at what fell, thinking it was an object which made the noise, but everything was as my mom had left it. I crawled back to bed, ready to resume my sleep, but when I looked at the door once more, the man was on the wall with his back facing me. He turned to look towards me and grinned, and his eyes glowed red. I hid under the covers as any child would and stayed there for several minutes. I then removed the covers to see if he was gone. He wasn't by the door, but directly above me when I looked up. He grinned once more, and then let out a sharp shriek and skittered off along the ceiling into a dark corner and disappeared. He showed up several times over the next 3 years, haunting my nights. Then he was gone for years, and I thought I was the only one to encounter him until the age of 16, when I was telling my friend about a green little man with red eyes, sharp teeth, and a loud shriek. He stopped talking and looked at me as if I was a ghost. He continued with a story too similar to be a coincidence. Another comment mentions a dream they had of a, quote, 2-foot-tall, green-skinned, red-eyed imp. The author of the original story we read doesn't mention the height of the Green Man they saw, but I found it interesting that these two comments mention the being they saw being of a shorter stature, a true little green man. It does make me think of them being possible denizens of fairy. As folklorist Gary Varner says, green has been known for untold ages as the color of fairy. It was so universally recognized as the color of fairy that many in Scotland refused to wear it, as to do so would invite the anger of the fairy folk. While it's usually green clothes that the fairies are known to wear, there are some green-skinned fairies. But we'll get to those later on. For now, let's move on to our next story. It was submitted by Sour Moon Fruit from Florida, and it's called The Green Face. This happened to me when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents and I were living in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. It was in a nice neighborhood with a cul-de-sac. Like many children around my age are, I was always afraid to sleep alone in the dark. So my mom started sleeping in the same bed with me until I fell asleep. Then she would go back to her room with my dad. On one of those nights, my mom said she would lie down next to me later, but forgot and fell asleep with my dad. Not wanting to wake her up, I decided to just be a big girl and sleep by myself. When I was sleeping, I heard my name being called. It was in a whisper, as if it was trying to get my attention. It said my name again. I opened my eyes, and right there at the entrance of my closet, I saw a green face. It was floating, and it whispered my name again. I didn't know what to think. I just got out of bed and walked out of my room while still looking at it, and it was looking back at me. I go to my parents' bedroom and say, "Dad, there's a green face in my closet." I was tapping his foot, and my mom answered, "Good, I hope it gets you." With that, I just went back to my room, and it was still there. I put the covers over myself and put the pillow over my head. Nothing else happened that night. I don't know what it was, but I wasn't really scared or anything. I just think it was there and wanted me to acknowledge it. I never saw it again. I'm sure tired moms say a lot of things they don't mean, but I think we can all agree that that was not a very nice thing for her mother to say to a child who's scared of the dark. Green faces are not. A floating, whispering green face. Pretty eerie. And it just had to be in the closet, didn't it? While you may think that the author was at a very young age when she had this experience, and maybe it was just an overactive imagination or her eyes playing tricks on her, she's not the only person to report seeing the green face. 2 others write of their own experiences in the comments. One person says, "I experienced the exact same thing when I was about 9 or 10. I was getting up one morning to go somewhere with my dad, and I saw the green face staring in the window from outside. I ran to the other room after staring at it for a few seconds, and then when I came back, it was gone. I was reading a fictional comedy book that made a reference to a floating green face, and it brought the memory back up. I googled to see if anybody else had had the same experience, and it seems you are the only other person. It's strange. I wonder what it was, or what it meant." But they're not the only other person. There is yet another who saw the floating green face. Jenny writes, "Exact same thing happened to me when I was in the 4th or 5th grade. I had just taken my shower in my parents' bedroom, and I put my clothes on and was blow-drying my hair. I turned around to see what the time was because I had school the next day, and I wanted to know if it was time for me to go to sleep. I somehow glance at the window, and I see a green face staring at me. The green face was really scary, though. The skin was pure green and almost looked like it was kind of decaying or drooping down the thing's face. It also had red eyes. I was shocked, and I couldn't even scream. Literally, the most terrifying moment of my life. I think about it every time I take a shower, every time I'm next to a window." I've said it before, there's something really creepy to me about faces staring at you from the window. So this entity that Jenny mentioned had red eyes, like the green man in the first story we read, but the face she saw also had a new, disturbing element to it that no one else had mentioned thus far. The drooping, decaying skin. Pretty unique, right? Well, not quite. Let's read our next story by Kama from South Carolina, called Terrifying Green Visitor. This isn't a story I've ever been comfortable sharing with anyone. I believe the only person I've recounted it to is a long-distance friend because I simply can't bring myself to speak about it out loud. No one who knows me in person knows of this story. Even though my family is fairly accepting of this sort of thing, recalling the event even in my mind terrifies me too much to think about discussing it in person with anyone. I was probably around 7. I'd been living a few miles outside of a small town in South Carolina, located on the Georgia border on Lake Russell, for a few years at this point, with my mom, my dad, and my brother. The night this happened, my dad wasn't at home. He was out of town for work. This means including me, there were only 2 other people in the house. It was sometime after midnight, I would say, that I woke up for no particular reason, couldn't get back to sleep. My door was open a crack, and the hall light was on, as it was every night. I wasn't afraid of the monster under my bed or the boogeyman in the closet, but my bedroom door couldn't be completely closed or completely open. Closed, and it was too dark for me to sleep. Open all the way, and I always felt like there was something standing in my door, watching me, making it absolutely impossible for me to sleep. My mom was fine with the hall light being on at night for me, and my door was cracked about 4, maybe 5 inches at night to let the light in. I'm unsure of how much time passed with no event, but I know that at some point, the door swung open. Not hard enough to bang off of my bedroom wall and wake anyone else up. I could hear my brother snoring in the room across the hall. Immediately after it opened, in ran something that still haunts my nightmares to this day. This thing stopped, turned, and jumped at me, over top of me, and froze in midair above me. I got a very good look at it. It was a little shorter than average adult height. Its clothes were ragged and moldy, and its flesh was peeling and decomposing. Its face was, in fact, mostly a skull. I remember there were eyes in the sockets, but they were just set into the sockets themselves. There was no skin around that part of the face. There were flaps of skin remaining around the lips and chin, and hair was covering where the ears would have been. Not exceptionally long hair, just down to where the earlobe would be, and it looked very brittle and old. I saw the hands still had most of their flesh, but there were still chunks missing from them, and the arms were bad enough that bone was showing straight through where some of the flesh was gone. The figure was slightly translucent, enough that I could see my ceiling straight through it as it hovered over me, but not so much that its details weren't all very vivid. It was also completely green. Perhaps not glowing green, but definitely a sickly sort of green all over, and it hovered over me silently and did nothing else. I couldn't do anything but look at it. I thought this had to be a nightmare. It positively had to be. When I'm in a bad dream and I realize I'm dreaming, I blink 3 times hard, and after the 3rd blink, I would be awake. It's still a trick that works for me today a lot of times, but only if I realize it's a nightmare before I awaken by some other means. Needless to say, I tried my trick. I blinked 3 times, as hard as I could, and when I opened my eyes, positively nothing had changed. It was still there. I don't know how long I was still for before I finally clenched my eyes shut and sat straight up in a sudden fit of bravery. When I opened my eyes after that, I was sitting in bed and the apparition was gone. I never saw it again. A very chilling and bizarre encounter. Really a ghastly being that they saw. I can't imagine how terrifying it'd be to see something running into your room as you lay in bed at night. How do you all weigh in on the door open, door closed dilemma? Which is more unsettling? If you have the door shut, then you can't see what's on the other side. But if you have it open, then you are more vulnerable to whatever is on the other side. The author, of course, opted for something in between, the cracked door, which I think may actually be the creepiest option, because the door is much more prone to slowly creaking open, much like happened in the story. I'm a door opened kind of girl. I can't hear a noise on the other side of the door and just be left wondering what's going on out there and be left waiting, wondering if something's going to come to the door, or if I have to go and look and see what made the noise. No, I gotta see what's going on. Anyway, I have one more story to read from you, and then a little tale of folklore I'd like to share. This last story took place in California and was submitted by Skittles29. It's called Green Glowing Little People. This happened in 1983, when I was 11 years old. My family and I just finished moving into our place in Nuevo, California. My sister Rihanna and I shared a room together, and her bed was closest to the door. I must have had childhood insomnia, because I always had a really hard time getting to sleep, so I was still awake at around 1 a.m. My mom had left the hall light on for us, and our bedroom door was partly open, so it was not very dark in my room. For some reason, I looked towards the door, into the part of the hallway I could see from my bed, and at that moment, I saw these 2 green glowing little people floating into my room and right towards me. They were easy to see because they were backlit from the hall light, and they were glowing brightly. Even though there were 2 of them, it was as if there was just one, because they never moved independent of each other. I thought of them as pilgrims when I later recalled this experience, because the girl had on a long, old-fashioned dress with an apron on the front and wore a bonnet. The boy had on a jacket and long, bulky shorts, or short, bulky pants, and some kind of top hat. I call them little people because they were only about 1.5 feet tall. I was so scared watching them get closer to me, and when they were almost to my bed, I threw my blankets over my head and really hoped I didn't feel them crawl up my bed onto me. When I couldn't breathe under the blankets anymore, I slowly pulled the blankets down off my head to see if they were still there, but they were gone. I never saw them again after this experience. I've always wondered what they were, and why I only saw them once, and why they seemed to be interested in me, and where did they go? Does anyone have any ideas what they were and why they were glowing green and so little? That story isn't as terrifying as the last one we read, but it's still pretty spooky. I can imagine the two pilgrim-dressed beings floating hand in hand through the author's room. As to what the entities were, some suggestions in the comments are fairies, due to their size, aliens, or ghosts, since they seem to be wearing clothes from a bygone era. The author mentions in the comment section that this experience happened 30 years ago at the time of their posting in 2013, so it's something that certainly stuck with them. In addition to suggestions of identification in the comments, there are also a couple of people who share their own similar experiences. I'll read them for you. This first one's pretty long. I joined up on this website specifically to comment about your story. Somewhere around 5 to 8 years old, approximately 1979 to 1982, I reported a little glowing green man to my parents after one of many terrifying nights of poor sleep in our new house. My bedroom was on one back corner of the house. My parents' room was on the other back corner, with the living room in the middle. I absolutely hated going to bed at night, often making my mom stay in the room and rock the bed and sing me to sleep. I had a small walk-in closet in my room on the opposite corner from my bed, and I remember always being worried about something coming out of that closet. None of which is particularly unusual, I suppose, for a little kid. But I often woke up hitting the ground next to my bed, apparently having rolled off in a dream of some kind, after which I was generally scared to death, and I have vivid memories of wrapping a blanket around myself and walking down the dark hallway to the kitchen, and then to my parents' bedroom, or, when they started locking their door, the living room couch. On one such couch night, I remember being frightened out of my wits, peering out occasionally from the blanket I'd drawn up over my face, and I saw a little glowing green man, maybe about 2 feet tall, across the living room, apparently paying me no mind, and sort of checking out the area underneath the small bar that connected the living room to the kitchen. He had upward pointed ears, and he was wearing what I think was a reflective silver outfit, and boots with fold-over cuffs. He was somewhat portly, and did not have a menacing demeanor. I have no memory of interaction with this entity, only that single sighting across the living room. The brief memory ended when he simply walked straight into the wall under the bar and disappeared. I reported all this to my parents the next day, including a drawing I'd made of what I saw. That's a very interesting encounter. So some of their description of the creature sounds like a fairy or a goblin. The green hue, the pointed ears, but the clothing does sort of give it that UFO edge with the silver suit and boots. Additional details this commenter gives after the experience took place do suggest a UFO leaning as well. They go on to say, around the same time as the experience, I took a big interest in space travel and astronautics. Maybe a little odd for a 6-year-old, but who knows. At the beginning of my sophomore year in high school, my mother and I moved to a small cottage on a wooded loop of similar abodes, bordering FDR State Park in Pine Mountain, Georgia. During high school and early college years, I remember waking up in the middle of the night unable to move or even breathe, and focusing all my mental effort into just simply rolling over onto my back and inhaling. I never saw anything in my room, but I recall a tone or ringing in my head during some or possibly all of these paralysis events. After a restless night, my mom discovered a bunch of tiny boot prints in the loose or damp dirt in the tapering crawl space under her cabin. I hated that cabin. Somewhere around 1993, I read Communion by Whitley Strieber, and that was the beginning of my education on the visitor/paranormal entity phenomenon. Before that point, such things were not even on my radar. Let me read one more comment for you from Kia Abigail. It says, I stumbled upon this post Googling what I had seen when I was a kid. My family still brings up the story that I had told them when I was younger. I had a very eerie, similar experience to you. I still suffer from having a lot of trouble sleeping, and I'm assuming I did as a child as well. When I was younger, I shared a room with my little sister and was awake and saw exactly the same thing you are describing. There were two women dressed in almost pilgrim-like clothing wandering around my room, and I've always described them as to almost be looking for something. They floated up to my sister's bed first and looked at her for quite some time before coming to me. I still have no explanation. These are all fascinating accounts, and who's to say if these beings were fairies, aliens, ghosts, or some sort of hypnagogic hallucination or dream. Whatever it was, they're certainly intriguing stories, and it reminded me of another old story of two mysterious green children. Have you ever heard of the Green Children of Woolpit? It's a legend, or maybe a real story, that was alleged to take place in 12th century Suffolk, England, in a village called Woolpit. Two children were found standing beside a wolf pit, an animal trapping pit, lined on the inside with stone. The village is named after these pits. I'll read the remainder of the story from British folklorist Catherine Mary Briggs' book, The Fairies in English Tradition and Literature. They were of a pale, greenish color. They seemed stupefied and frightened and did not understand what was said to them. They refused all food at first, and finally ate broad beans with great eagerness. They gradually learned to eat mortal food. The boy pined and died, but the girl survived, lost her green color, and learned to talk. According to her account, they lived in an underground country where there was neither sun nor moon, but a soft light like twilight. One day, they entered a cavern and heard a soft sound like distant bells, which they followed until they emerged into the full light of day. The sunlight so stupefied them that they fell to the ground and were caught. Both children were baptized, and the girl grew up and married a local man, but she was always rather free and wanton in her behavior. Apparently, the girl called the country she came from St. Martin's Land, and an additional detail that crops up in some versions of the tale is that everything in the children's homeland, much like their skin, was green. It's a compelling and fascinating story that's been circulating for the last 900 years or more. The village of Woolpit even has a sign bearing the green children that was erected in 1977. By some, including the 12th century historian who first recorded this tale, it's believed to be a factual account, though most people now accept it as an old folktale. We've said throughout this video that fairies, aliens, and ghosts are all known to have a green hue. These children's skin and their passage through some strange cavern could point to any of these origins and associations. Did they travel from space? A fairy realm? The underworld? In her book, Catherine Briggs says, perhaps only a coincidence, but beans are traditionally the food of the dead. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed the stories and that you found them strange and unusual.
Editing Goblin announcement.
Actually, I just wanted to add something really quickly. As I was in the process of recording and editing this video, I was listening to the, at the time, most recently released episode of the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts, and I've suggested it before on here. But I was listening to their most recent episode, and the guest that they have on tells a very interesting first-hand encounter they have with a green being who comes up to their window. So, I do want to suggest that if you liked these stories. It's also just a really, really good episode and a great podcast. So, I'll have that on the screen if you want to look up that specific episode, and I'll also put a link to it in the description of the video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a cozy and pleasant evening. I'll see you all next time. Toodles!